All right, everyone, welcome to Quillette Circle NYC, the Q Spot podcast. I'm Jeremy, this is Lewis. Very honored to have Ben tonight. By a show of hands, who watched about 5 weeks ago the Jordan Peterson Slavoj Žižek debate, the name I'm going to mispronounce 10 times tonight? Show of hands, so about half the room. Who wishes they had 3 hours of their life back when it was over? 1, 2. So you guys really liked it. All right, it's going to be challenging tonight. So Ben comes from a very progressive background, and it was really cool. He got to write an article for Quillette about this very topic, talking specifically about Jordan Peterson and cultural Marxism, which we're going to go into tonight. But first things first, Ben has a new book coming out this week. Some of you guys probably saw on Facebook, called Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. I'm super excited to read it. It comes out Friday. You can get it on Amazon. So we're going to split this conversation a bit because obviously this book is pretty pertinent to tonight's discussion, to the core of this group, and obviously not mutually exclusive from the topic at hand. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about this book, and then we're going to go more into the crux of Ben's article. Did everyone get a chance to read Ben's article on the Jordan Peterson Marxist idea? I'm sure it was linked to in our thing. So that's super cool. We're going to dissect it a bit and talk about some of our agreements and some of our disagreements. So first, big hand for Ben, coming all the way from New Jersey to be here tonight. All right. So I think everyone in the room's ears and eyes perked up when they saw this Logic for the Left, because many people here joined this group initially because they find the left is a bit illogical in the last, 10 to 15 years. So I'm curious, what possessed you to write this book? What are the main ideas from it, and how do you want people to perceive it?
Sure. So if I'm incoherent in a way that I can't justify by just having hopped on the train from New Jersey, it's because for the last 3 days I've been on the road. My wife and I were visiting family in Michigan, and we were try to get back last night, but we ended up having to stay an extra night, and so the long hours of driving with the cat meowing in the car just ended. But to answer your question, part of the book is an attempt to do something that would be useful to people, to break down some things about how arguments work that I would cover in like a critical reasoning or logic class, that I would teach. But from a particular perspective, and it's linked to a certain kind of critique that might not have the same perspective on, but it's related to what you're talking about. So I think that there's been a phenomenon whereby some people who don't identify with the political goals of the left, possibly reacting to what they see as, the excesses of, woke culture, things like that, sort of have this attitude that, hey, we on the right, or we on the IDW, or we libertarians, or, et cetera, are all about logic or facts and logic and evidence. And then a lot of people who are in my corner sort of get sick of hearing that, and then I think maybe overreact to it. So they overreact to it by kind of rolling their eyes whenever they start to hear somebody talk like that, which I think is very counterproductive. Because for one thing, that means that oftentimes people don't really practice the art of breaking down arguments and seeing what's wrong with them and all, and would they go wrong, and how to construct a good one, and all of that stuff to the extent that they should. And oftentimes they'll kind of substitute mockery or moral condemnation for those things. And look, I'm not above mockery. I mock things. There are things in the world that deserve to be condemned, but if those are the only tools in your arsenal, then that's really bad. And it's really bad not just in a sort of general principled way, but it's really bad for whatever political goals you're trying to carry out, because for one thing, you're going to lose persuadable people. And for another thing, when those are your only tools for pushing back against the people you disagree with on the big things, when disagreements arise within your camp, those are inevitably the tools you're going to turn on each other, and that's just incredibly annoying and alienating to ordinary people.
So I have like 1,000 questions, and I'm sure everyone here's mine is just spinning from that because there's so much to say. You said your camp, and so I've always found, and people have heard me say this about 1,000 times now, the left, generally speaking, is centrist Democrats, Antifa, social justice warrior type people, and progressives. And we've had a lot of people here. We had Michael Tracy here, who you know. We've had Aaron Mate here. And would you say that your group, your segment, is much more into persuasive, logical arguments, even though they're much more leftist centered?
To an extent, I think so. I mean, I might divide up the political map a little bit differently, and I don't want to get too hung up on that, how to classify people. But I would typically make a distinction between liberals in the sense of sort of the Democratic Party, and, like just crudely, people who watch MSNBC, and the left, which I would think of as like DSA, people who, just to simplify like crazy, anybody who voted for Bernie Sanders or anything to the left of that.
Sure. And so generally speaking, I haven't had a chance to read your book because it's not out yet. I was really going to, but I did a little perusing online. And so your general argument, which I think most of the people on the right tend to agree with, is that the left generally argues with emotion. Everything's an emotional response. If I say I'm pro-life, which I'm not, but if I said that, the general response to the left would be, oh, you hate women, you think they shouldn't do X, A, B, C, and D. Well, first of all, do you agree with that sentiment? And when did this actually come about within the history of the left?
Yeah, so I agree with part of what you're saying. So I think that the part that I agree with is that sometimes people make the mistake of just sort of condemning people for having the wrong position rather than trying to convince them that it is the wrong position, and assuming that everybody with that position is married to it and can't be swayed, right? I think that's wrong. And so I think we're on the same page there. Where I maybe disagree is that I think that this whole issue of the relationship between logic, making good arguments, and emotions, emotional attachment to positions, I think is a little confused for a lot of people, and I think Star Trek has done a lot of damage here because it convinced generations of American television viewers that something called logic and emotions are somehow in tension with each other. And what I get out of reading David Hume, who there's a cartoon of on the cover of the book, is that we need to be more careful there and make a distinction between facts and values, right? We can have evidence-based reasoning about how to achieve the goals that we care about, but the facts by themselves can't tell us what goals to care about in the first place, right? So there's no conflict. It's not like the ideal thing is to reason out what your political positions are directly by inferring them logically from the facts, because that can't be done. That's in fact, there's a law of logic, that says you literally can't validly go from factual premises to moral or political normative conclusions. So it's not that moral emotions, being outraged about injustice, things like that, don't have a legitimate role to play, or even that that's incompatible with good reasoning. But we do. But of course, we can also argue with people about that stuff, and we should, right? You shouldn't. It's not that there's one position you could have about abortion that just comes from the raw facts, and there's another that doesn't come from it. Any valid argument about an issue like this is going to have a moral premise in there somewhere. Premise about what you value, what you care about, but. Again, I think the place where we maybe do agree is that it is important to break down how those arguments work and not just go straight to, oh my God, you're such a monster, I can't believe you disagree with me.
So, following the 2016 election, there were a number of different articles published on different sites that seemed to suggest that making emotional arguments was more effective than using fact-based ones. And I've also seen conservatives and those that on what you would call the right make the same case that crafting narratives are more effective than using fact-based arguments. And I'm curious if there's any area where you feel the same way in that regard.
Yeah. So All right, so the annoyingly nitpicky part of the answer is that, again, I'd veer away from just saying fact-based argument as if there was a good argument you could make about any of these things that is purely about facts. In fact, I think this is a major source of confusion about a lot of these issues, because anytime you make an argument for any kind of conclusion about whether abortion is morally acceptable or not, whether it's important to, call trans people by the correct pronouns or not, there might be premises about empirical facts that are doing some work in that argument, but they're not doing all the work, right? It's never just a fact-based argument. There's also an evaluative premise there, right? Like anything that's biologically human has a right to life, right? That if you don't have that in place, none of the factual things you might say in the course of making the anti-abortion argument are going to be relevant. So that's the nitpicky part. But look, I'm sure it is true that oftentimes in many contexts people are more swayed by narratives than by the kind of arguments that I'm talking about. And I don't think that's illegitimate, right? It's not like I think that political candidates should stop, telling stories to evocatively, get across their points or anything like that. But I do think that one powerful tool that we do have that it's important that we not get away from is actually making arguments. That not because that's always the most effective tactic in every situation, but if we want to make sure that we're right, that we want to reason carefully about these things, it's important that we be good at making good arguments.
And I'm curious, what do you make of the Jonathan Haidt view of how humans formulate thoughts and form their moral, presuppositions, if you will?
Yeah, so I think that some of the Haidt stuff, you thinking the studies maybe that are supposed to show that that people with more progressive views are only evaluating things on axes of fairness and empathy, and people with more conservative views are also bringing in the stuff about I forget all of his categories, but sacredness and profanity, etc.
I can never remember all.
Yeah, fair enough, right? I think there might be some truth to that, and that goes to Hume's point that it's not that it's entirely possible that there are going to be contexts in which people agree about all of the relevant empirical facts, and they're reasoning equally well, but they come to different conclusions because they have different underlying moral values. I absolutely don't think that that's something you can rule out, but it's also important not to just not to give up in the first 30 seconds of the game. That you might be able to convince people by appealing to those values that you do share, and so it is still important to try to reason about these things, even though it's possible, and in certain situations may be predictable that you're just not going to agree because you have different underlying values. But the goal isn't necessarily always even when you're debating somebody, the goal isn't necessarily to convince the other person on the stage. The goal isn't necessarily to convince their most hardcore supporters who are most likely to have the deeply incompatible values from yours, right? The goal is to convince persuadable people.
Okay, so I'm sure people have tons of questions about this, but so would you say, you said emotional arguments is one general flaw of what you can say the current leftists today, regardless of how broken up that is. There was a famous quote a while ago, everyone here knows very well, when AOC was asked, or she said, it's more important to be morally right than factually right. Would you say this is sort of permeating, I don't want to say the leftist brain because that's too general, but sort of the collective ideas that people on the left are taught these days in terms of how to go about convincing people of their point of view?
Well, I'm kind of conflicted right now because I'm really tempted to do the sort of tedious and predictable kind of culture war thing and say, well, actually, if you really look at the context of that quote, I don't think that's I think that she was admitting to having screwed certain things up, but she was making a point about how we evaluate the relative importance, right, of minor factual errors, and and I understand the way that quote was used, but I maybe have a little bit of a different take on it. But look, I think that it's important when you're dealing with this to not be too quick to believe people's hype, right? Because oftentimes, like the flip side of what I'm saying, that like sometimes people on my side are too quick to sort of roll their eyes when they hear people start talking this way, or to sort of treat like worrying about logical fallacy as ways that arguments can go wrong as if it's some sort of like arbitrary and prissy set of conventions that they're being asked to care about. Like, this is like the Marquise of Queensberry rules for, for debate or something like that. And I do think that's bad and that should be pushed back against. But the flip side of that is that like, I wouldn't be too quick to say that what you're talking about is more of a problem for the left than for the right, or for some people who might consider themselves to be classical liberals, but sound pretty right wing to me.
I think we know who you're talking about.
Because I think that because it seems to me that just because somebody makes a big deal, right, about saying, oh yeah, I care a lot about facts and logic and evidence. Oftentimes these things are kind of wielded almost like just as mantras, right? Just because people like to describe themselves that way doesn't mean that they're well described that way. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, that I really want to sort of encourage people who disagree with them, who agree with me, to really engage on that territory, because I think often when one side says, "Oh yeah, no, I'm really out here making good arguments and destroying people with the force, of my arguments," and then the other side's just kind of rolling their eyes,
right.
Then the claims of the first guy aren't really being examined, and oftentimes those are pretty weak, right?
Right.
I don't think that like motivated reasoning, for example, that people are more likely to come to conclusions that conform with their initial biases. I certainly wouldn't accept that. That's something that's more common among the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world than among the I don't know pick your example
Right.
of a politician elsewhere in the spectrum.
So in conclusion for this part, and I'm sure people have lots of questions, so if you would say your goal for this book is essentially you would take some sort of social justice where you're a caricature, like the woman screaming when Trump was elected has become this famous meme, and just kind of shake her and say, read this, and I want you to understand that. Complete the sentence.
All right. Well, actually, don't read this book. Just spend some, just calm down, watch some TV or something. Focus on other things for a while. Then when your head is a little bit clear, and you want to think about how to achieve some goals. Maybe we don't agree on everything. I don't know. You're being, finding. I think that you're probably other stuff is going on in your life that you have quite that extreme a reaction to it. But I hate Trump too. We probably have some political goals in common, right? And so if you want to think harder about how to achieve those goals, maybe this book will be helpful to you at some point.
All right. So if she's listening, or he or they, please buy this book. All right. Let's move on to Jordan Peterson, Cultural Marxism. So you said about half the people in the room watched the debate, and I think the first words out of Jordan Peterson's mouth were, "I haven't read Karl Marx since I was 18." And I think we all said, "What? What are you talking about? You've been talking about Marx and Marxism for 3 years now. This is how you're famous. It's like the Pope going and delivering a sermon and said, I haven't read the New Testament since I was 18, more or less." So I think everyone was very surprised by this. And your entire argument was that he doesn't understand Marxism in terms of the idea of how you take the thoughts of Marx and they go into what he's seeing today as the problem with sort of culture, more or less. So can you break down a bit sort of the main parts of what you disagree with him, specifically related to this idea of cultural Marxism?
Okay. When Peterson is debating Slavoj Žižek in his opening presentation, he says that he's going to talk about the Communist Manifesto because he says that's where all the trouble starts. And And so this is an important note, because like one thing that some people said in response to the article is, oh well, he's not debating the ghost of Karl Marx, right? He's debating Slavoj Žižek, and Žižek is kind of an eclectic thinker anyway. He calls himself a Marxist. He's influenced by Marxism, but he's also influenced by lots of other things. It's not necessarily, Marxism is in the debate title, but it's not necessarily a debate about that. Why are you giving him such a hard time about this? And I think the important thing to note here is that Peterson is the one who's framing it that way. Right? Peterson is saying he devotes his entire opening presentation to talking about the Communist Manifesto and Karl Marx. He doesn't reference anything that Žižek wrote. He just says, I've decided. In fact, he says he also kind of indicates that he didn't really read much Žižek leading up to it. Because ran out of time or whatever, so he decided he was going to reread the Communist Manifesto, which he indicates that he read. He's reading for the first time in 40 years. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto, right, if it's like, okay, like this book, just to put this in perspective, this book is much thicker than the Communist Manifesto, right? There are editions of the Communist Manifesto that have like 10 introductions and prefaces that are still a little bit thinner than this book. And so if he's rereading this for the first time in 40 years, it's probably safe to say that he wasn't, devoting, in between his teaching and his, giving therapy to his clients, that he probably wasn't like rereading all 3 volumes of Capital or anything like that. So, and then that's kind of bad enough, but then given a lot of what he said, I'm not convinced that he fully understood even that, right? Because a lot of the claims that he makes, he doesn't seem to quite understand how it is that Marx is saying that capitalism tremendously develops the productive forces of society and is this like great historical progress. Right. In fact, Peterson seems to sort of perceive this as kind of a contradiction or Marx conceding something, right? When really the opening chunk of the Communist Manifesto is largely about how capitalism has been a great improvement on feudalism and really developed the forces of production and all this stuff. Marx's analysis is that each mode of production, right, going from, before feudalism, you have what he calls Asiatic modes of production or like Roman-style slave societies that sort of morph into feudalism, then feudalism is replaced by capitalism, and then Marx hopes that capitalism will be replaced by socialism. And Marx thinks that each successive mode of production is going to develop the productive forces of society. We're going to be able to have more stuff. We're going to have better stuff, and it's going to, and that capitalism is going to finally lift up the level of social development to the point where you can have socialism, right? So like Marx's analysis of a lot of what happened with the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror is that the Jacobins were kind of in a bind because they're being supported by like the sans-culottes, right, the poor people in Paris, whose really what they needed was guaranteed bread, right? But given just the technological level of development of the economy in France at the time, there's really no good way to give what they wanted there, right? That there was that there just weren't the resources to redistribute to all of these people. There wasn't, you couldn't have had, in Marx's analysis, socialism in 1789 in France because there just wasn't the technological basis for it. So that's why they had to sort of start cutting off all these heads, because if we can't give you bread, we can at least give you your enemy, like we can at least give you the suffering of your enemies, right? That like all these rich people that you hate. So Marx thinks that the development of capitalism at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, has finally developed productive forces of society to the point where we can have a decent society, where everybody's needs are taken care of, where everybody's where people can have the sort of creative fulfillment that he thinks they can have once you don't have to go to work for somebody else. You can work in this cooperative setting. Marx thinks that as that like under a socialist society, as technology advances, unlike capitalism, where as technology advances and you have automation, some people just lose their jobs, right? Under socialism, if you have workers' control of the means of production, workers can just kind of vote themselves fewer hours as you have automation, and have more time for creative, more fulfilling pursuits, et cetera, right? This is his vision of society, and he thinks that capitalism is both the thing that enables us to finally be able to achieve that vision, and is the last thing that's standing in its way, right? So it's a little bit of a complicated analysis, but Peterson in his presentation seems just kind of confused about why it is or how it is that Marx could be against capitalism, but still saying that capitalism is leading to all this economic and technological development. And Peterson at one point said that, well, look, if you look at since 1800 or whatever it is to the present day, extreme poverty has declined such and such, so isn't capitalism great, right? And of course, there is a real argument to be had about that, right? Whether as a matter of fact, especially if you're focused on more recent history, whether capitalism continues to be, kind of the best bet for human development, or whether some other system, could do better. That's a real substantive argument that intelligent people could disagree with each other about. But I think that what he's missing in that critique is that what Marx would say is, most of what you're talking about is just going from rural pre-industrial forms of social organization to industrial development. And I always said that was what capitalism was good for, right? It's, a lot of this, in fact, rise out of extreme poverty that he's talking about. In fact, the major chunk of it, if you look in the last few decades, has happened in China, which is a really interesting case because it's, sort of a lot of China just a few decades ago was kind of no more developed than it was under feudalism. And it's been developed by this strange combination of free markets and a level of state intervention that you don't have in Western countries. So I think that a more interesting in the article, I go through, and we could go through this, but I've been going on for a little while, but like a lot of specific things that I think Peterson gets wrong about Marx. But here's the larger point, right? That it's not like the right answers to these questions are obvious. It's certainly not like, even if you do think they're obvious, it's certainly not like they're universally agreed on, right? We have, if nothing else, right, there's a larger percentage of the American public who say, who tell pollsters that they approve of socialism, whatever they mean by that, right, than any time before now in American history. Conversely, people who are very opposed to that, like Jordan Peterson, are superstars. So, this is clearly something where it's not obvious to everybody what the right answer is, and I think that certainly having an argument about Marx would be a really interesting way to frame that debate, because Marx is like one of history's like great thinkers, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about capitalism, socialism, etc. But I think regardless of what you think about it, right, whether you're on Team Marx and you want better critics to make you hone your arguments by clashing with them, or whether you're on Team Free Markets and you want the best possible spokesman for your view, either way, right, from either perspective, if we're going to have a good argument about this, I think it's a little bit unfortunate that the sort of debate of the century about capitalism and Marxism and everything, that Jordan Peterson was the guy put in this position of criticizing Marx, that I think at the very least, I know people are annoyed when they hear this. Maybe this is just my professorishness coming out, but you just got to do your damn reading.
So I think something that, like a small nugget that I can extract from that is a point of agreement for libertarians and socialists is that the number one enemy of capitalism is capitalists. And that's been something that I've been hearing socialists and libertarians saying for quite some time now. And like I'm curious, like it seems from what you're saying here that you find that to be true as well.
Yeah, can you expand a little bit about what you mean there?
So that, like, from the libertarian perspective, like they view capitalists to be an enemy of capitalism by their increased demand for state intervention. Like some of our, some of our, like, you see what I'm saying here, then, yeah. And I guess so. There's a point during Jordan Peterson's career where he made like a massive effort to start talking about postmodernism, cultural Marxism, like critical theory, and so on and so forth. And I'm curious as to where you view his critiques to be, where do you view them to have gone astray of like what these institutions are actually vying for?
Yeah. So I think that the starting point there has to be disentangling exactly who he's talking about, right? So one of the most revealing moments to me in the debate, besides the one we talked about, this was a little bit later on. Some people may have stopped watching, by then. They enjoyed it as little as you did, but was when they'd sort of done their initial presentations and everything. It was a little bit more informal, back and forth. I think Žižek was still on the couch, and and then he was like talking to him like from the podium, and Žižek says, these are, you keep talking about this postmodern neo-Marxist,
You're missing the lisp.
All right, it's a work in progress by Žižek, but he says, who are they? Name some names, right? And Peterson kind of doesn't, right? He says, well, if you look at the, Heterodox Academy and look at what they say about these people, then, he sort of mentions some names of people who agree with him making similar critiques, but he doesn't really say, like, hey, when I talk about these postmodern neo-Marxists, I'm talking about Professor X at University Y who says Z, right? Which would have been incredibly helpful if he had, because this is something that I think, like a lot of left critics of Peterson, I'm often baffled by, because from my perspective, think, okay, well, hold on. Postmodernism, post-structuralism in French philosophy is something that arose in rebellion against what they call grand narratives, right? That sort of try to explain everything in one big theory, whereas postmodernists, for various reasons, think you can't do that. And not only is Marxism exactly that kind of grand narrative about history and all this stuff, but post-Marxism is, in fact, the grand narrative a lot of these guys had in mind, right? So Michel Foucault, for example, is a big postmodernist philosopher, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a big Marxist philosopher at the same time, hated each other, right? Like in that sort of overly dramatic way that only French intellectuals can hated each other. So when he says, oh, these postmodern neo-Marxists, I mean, I don't want to be too absolutist about it, because I think every time in my life I've ever said nobody thinks X, somebody can always find me an example of someone somewhere who thinks it, right? That's, so I don't want to say that, but I think at the very least, sure. It could be that there are people out there who are influenced by both of these things or find ways to combine certain strands of them, maybe, right? But this idea that Peterson often suggests, that the universities are just full of this well-defined category, these postmodern neo-Marxists, or sometimes, to my mind, even less helpfully, he'll use the phrase cultural Marxists. I think, well, which is, well, okay, one, it's an unfortunate turn of phrase because, the more you look into it, it has a very bad history. Not to put too fine a point on it, I've never found somebody who calls themselves a cultural Marxist, but the, internet manifestos of, people who shoot up synagogues, tend to be full of denunciations of cultural Marxists, right? So I think that, I don't think that that's where he's getting it from, but I think that that's maybe a reason to be very careful about that term. But more importantly, I think that it's that all of this leads to a little bit of confusion about what he's talking about, because I think, as far as I can tell, what he's talking about when he critiques the postmodern neo-Marxists or postmodern Marxists or postmodern cultural Marxists, whatever, what he's talking about has very little to do with either Marxism or postmodernism. I think what he's talking about is a third thing, which is just kind of progressive cultural politics, something like that. He's talking about feminism and maybe movements for rights for gay or trans people and things like that. And what I sometimes hear from Peterson fans, when they're talking about this, is they say, okay, it's not that these people he's criticizing are literally Marxists, but it's that they have. It's that there's this sort of evolution from Marxism, or this sort of similarity to Marxism, because the same way that Marxism says that capitalists are oppressors and workers are oppressed, these so-called cultural Marxists will say that men are oppressors and women are oppressed, or that straight people are oppressors and gay people are oppressed, or things like that. So that's kind of a similar thing. And I think that even before we get into the actual rights and wrongs of any of these positions, right? What should we think about feminism? What should we think about trans issues? All this stuff. I think that analytically, that's just a really unhelpful way to frame it, because first of all, the key sort of concept of Marxism isn't oppression, it's exploitation, which is an economic concept, that workers are generating wealth that's then being controlled and taken off in the form of profits by capitalists. And secondly, it's such a low bar, right? Yeah, okay, even if you accept that there's some coarse-grained kind of similarity here, if that's all it takes to be a Marxist, that you believe that there are forms of oppression in the world and you're sympathetic to the oppressed people, then all the French revolutionaries were Marxists already, several decades before Marx was born. The author of the Book of Exodus was a Marxist, because they were describing, oppression of Jews by Egyptians. All the, Nat Turner was a Marxist, like that. That just seems like a really unhelpful way of using the word Marxism.
But don't you think, though, you said earlier that, right now socialism is as popular as ever, and if you ask people what is socialism, most people can't answer it. So isn't it possible that people for generations within academia have just been inundated with Marxism as sort of the overall philosophy that's going into humanities, anthropology, philosophy, et cetera, and I don't want to say they don't know it, because that would make them seem like they're just sitting on the sidelines, but it's just part of the overall culture. So when he cites the statistic about 25% of professors are Marxists, there's some people who are wearing the the communist flag.
Professors, or
I think he said professors in the humanities. You can fact check on that. There are some who are outright
like sociology or something.
Whatever.
But it doesn't matter. Go on.
Humanities in there. So I think in the debate he talked about David Harvey, who's a very prominent Marxist. So there's people like him.
David Harvey actually is a Marxist. Yeah.
Right, but then there's people who are just espousing some views, and they're under sort of the umbrella of Marxism within their overall studies. So I don't think it's that people aren't identifying it, and I admit he answered it in a kind of sloppy way, and it was actually kind of surprising to me. I just think he's trying to say that throughout the history over the last 50 years, this has been a major part of all these various disciplines.
Well, I think that there are. So I think that I can't really speak to the statistic. I do remember him saying that. We might remember exactly which subcategory of professors he was talking about slightly differently were. I also think that in some parts of academia, like academic historians, for example, right? Sometimes the word Marxism is used in like an extremely minimalistic way there, right? Like historians will use Marxism just to describe like being interested in economic class, right? In your historical analysis. Like, I have had this experience at least, right? I've talked to like a history grad student and they say, oh, I'm a Marxist, and I think we're about to have a much more interesting conversation than we are. And then they're just like, oh yeah, no, I'm like,
it's a cool thing to say.
Interested in economic, like it's not even just a cool thing to say. It's just that the meaning of the term has gotten so watered down from being used sort of to mean this specific disciplinary thing that makes me wonder about that, especially because you're talking about the last 50 years or whatever. Remember, it's not so long ago historically that the American universities were ideologically purged of anybody who called themselves a socialist or communist or anything like that.
Which made it more popular.
Well, maybe, right? But, like I think that, so during the mid-century, that was happening. There are more, I mean, obviously, since then, probably starting in the 60s or 70s or whatever, McCarthyism backed off and, you could be a Marxist university professor after that. And if you want to say that there's some line of lineage or that there's like some interesting, like that he wants to say from his critical perspective, hey, here's the thing that they're wrong about, and I think the source of this, right, like as he said in his debate with Žižek, the source of all the trouble is, right, something about Marxism. I'm not going to rule out in advance that he could have some kind of interesting critique there. All I'll say is I haven't seen it, right? What I've seen is when he really gets into this, he'll say things like he'll make some extremely dubious broad claims about the relationship between Marxism and postmodernism, and then he'll say that the really bad thing that these Marxists or postmodern neo-Marxists believe is equality of outcome. And then he'll start talking about why equality of outcome is really bad, and of course equality of opportunity is good, equality of outcome is bad. Sidebar, I'm not convinced that you can make a clean distinction there because one generation's outcomes are the next generation's opportunities. But then he'll sort of segue into what I was saying before. I think he means by cultural Marxist, which is he'll say, oh, but if we care about equality between every possible group, that we care about equality, between men and women, but we also care about equality between gay people and straight people and trans people and cis people, all this stuff. That you can just keep on cutting people up forever, and it's a nightmare to try to enforce all this equality. And I think there's a lot that you can say about that, but one very simple thing you can say about that is I have no idea what that's supposed to have to do with Marxism. Right? So if you read another Marx pamphlet that's just about as short as the Communist Manifesto, one of the last things Marx wrote, the Critique of the Gotha Program, which is one of the few places he talks about this, Marx criticizes the Lassallean wing of German socialists for talking about equality in distribution, and Marx says that actually in the early phases of a socialist society, you need some inequality in distribution to incentivize work. Marx thinks that, the sort of utopian part is Marx thinks that as technology develops enough and people sort of culturally evolve from where they were under capitalism, he thinks you'll eventually get to a point where what little labor hasn't been automated away, what little labor still has to be done by humans rather than machines, can just sort of get done by everybody pursuing their own interests, and that that technology will have created so much abundance that everybody can just kind of take what they want, right? But then, that's not this perfect equality vision either. That's just sort of saying, in the more advanced stage of a socialist society, Marx thinks that the whole issue of equality versus inequality is just kind of going to become moot, right? If there's enough to go around for everybody, you don't really need to keep track of the difference. And what he says is that we really shouldn't be that concerned with distribution anyway, because the question of how goods are distributed is secondary to the question of how the means of producing them is owned in the first place, and that the one is really going to be a function of the other, right? So the kind of picture I get from hearing Jordan Peterson talk about this, I always think of the movie Casino, the Scorsese movie, where there's a scene where the Robert De Niro's character, Ace Rothstein, is looking at his blueberry muffin, and he gets outraged, and he storms into the kitchen of the casino, and he holds up these two muffins as, you see, there are only a few blueberries in this, all these blueberries in this. From now on, exactly as many blueberries in every muffin. and the chef is just kind of staring at him like, do you have any idea how long that would take, right? So that's kind of the caricature, right? That, leftists are all about sort of trying to get like, have some all-powerful bureaucracy, make sure there are exactly as many blueberries in every muffin. And whereas, at least if you're talking about economic equality, I think that it is probably true that most people on the left think that the kind of inequality we have right now is unjustifiable. That, when you have some people literally eating gold leaf pizza that doesn't even seem like it would taste good, just as a sort of ostentatious display of wealth, and some people sleep on the streets, that, that's too much inequality.
But going back to Peterson.
Going back to Peterson. Sure,
so I was just going to say, I think in his defense, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to this, he would say that what we kind of talk about today with intersectionality, which I'm sure you're familiar with this term, that the straight white Christian male is the devil and the greatest person possible.
Is that what people think the intersectionality say?
You should go on Twitter.
Okay, but
then
Twitter is the worst representation
obviously
of every view and of humanity in general.
Which is another debate in and of itself. But basically
Twitter is the devil.
Twitter is the devil. We're in agreement on that. But he would argue that basically what Marx was doing is essentially saying there's the haves and the haves not, and he's demonizing the haves. And if you look at every single revolution under Marx, whether or not this stems from Marx is a completely different discussion. The first thing they did was to pick a group and say, these are the privileged people. And we're going to go after them. This happened in China and Russia and Cambodia, so on and so forth. And he's saying that there is a line in what you're seeing today with intersectionality, that they're looking at these people, the straight white Christian male who's in power, who doesn't have power, and let's completely draw these lines until we get it. And maybe to say that the effects of this are going to be, 100% equality is up for debate. But that there is power and there is not power, and we're seeing this today, I think, very, very clearly.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say about that is that I actually think that one of the differences between Marxist analysis and other ways of thinking about oppression or injustice, and in fact, I do think, look, I don't want to exaggerate too much here. I'm sure that there's overlap between the people who annoy you on Twitter and the people who annoy me on Twitter, and I think that some of what's wrong with some of the people in the left wing of that overlap is about demonizing people. That everything is about sort of moral, conscience. That like what is it to be, what is it to be a good ally, for example, right? Where the word ally means not what it's meant throughout, in all their contexts, but ally sort of means, person who's sort of acting acceptably, given that they're in this privileged category, right? And it is this very moralistic way of looking at things, and it is about demonizing people. But I actually think that, some of this gets back to the distinction that I was trying to make at the very top of the discussion when you first introduced the book about liberalism and leftism, because I think that one of the things that I like about the left side of that distinction is that instead of having an analysis of injustice that's about bad people having bad ideas in their heads, right? Or, in 2019 speak, having problematic ideas in their heads. It's about the structures of society being bad, right? Which strikes me as a really important distinction. Right? Because you can say that there's a social structure that's bad and that should be changed without demonizing anybody who happens to benefit from that structure.
Is that true, though?
Yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said it.
I suppose that's fair, but is it? Well, I guess the point I was trying to make is it? I guess taking human nature into account. Does one not naturally follow the other? If say, you start to criticize these structures, will it not naturally follow just by human nature that demonization will begin to occur as well?
Well, part of that might depend on what the alternative is, right? So, in other words, you're critiquing unjust social structures rather than doing what, right? So, And if the alternative is just kind of being happy with your lot and not minding, right, your what's happening to you in society, then sure, maybe maybe once you decide that this isn't okay, that this is unjust, that's going to lead you to being angry at the people on the other end of it. And I mean, look, full disclosure, I don't think that that's always unjustified. I think that I think that especially with regard to some of the people who have the most power in certain positions, I wouldn't claim that I have positive thoughts in my head about Jeff Bezos, for example, right? I appreciate him selling my book, but I really wish that the conditions in the Amazon warehouses were other than what they are. But when it comes to this issue of anger, I think that if we're focusing on what's wrong structurally, not with just being happy with your lot, right? But we're contrasting it with blaming individuals for it, right? We're saying, like, in other words, if you're being fired from your job, or you're being asked to work a lot of overtime, or your house is being repossessed by a bank, right? I think that if you aren't looking at it in a structural way, it's very likely that your analysis is going to be, this particular individual that I'm interacting with is a horrible asshole who's doing this to me, right? That, like, my boss, my landlord, the loan officer at the bank is a bad person, right? Whereas if you're looking at things structurally, you could say, well, maybe he is and maybe he's not, but the larger problem here is that a certain form of social organization has created bad incentives. And and that if he weren't acting this way, he probably couldn't keep that job anyway, that they'd find somebody who would act this way. And so I shouldn't really focus on, on Joe the loan officer. I should focus on the economic system. And I guess the last thing I'd say about this is I'm really leery about the kind of psychologizing ways of pushing back against complaints about structural injustice, that it's going to make you angry, it's going to make you unhappy, this isn't a good way to live, because of course that's always a game that can be played with any critique of anything, right? If you're a Soviet dissident and you're upset that you're not allowed to defect to the West, okay, come on, what's going to make you happier? Are you going to be upset about this, or are you going to focus on how your great-granddad was a serf and he wasn't even allowed to leave his estate, and he didn't have indoor plumbing, and look at how much better your life is than this guy, and you could travel all around Russia, and so are you going to focus on what you don't have, right, or on what you do have? And I think that whatever you want to say about that, it's not really very informative about which structural critiques are good structural critiques, because you could always kind of tell people, don't focus on being mad or whatever, right? I think a much better and much more instructive argument to have had is, do you have a legitimate complaint, not should you be mad about that complaint?
All right, there's a lot to chew on there, so I'm going to pass the mic around for audience questions. Just remind everyone to keep it civil, keep it on point. I'm sure many of you guys disagree with a lot of what Ben had to say, but let's try to make it constructive. Can I get a volunteer to just pass the mic between people? Can anyone volunteer? How do you want to do that? Since you give it over to Mr. Malinsky first.
Thank you very much, first of all. I'd say maybe it's best to get down to historical tact.
Yeah.
I would say a great deal of Peterson's and others' opposition to Marxism, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, is there's a straight line from Marx to Lenin to Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
How do you disabuse people of that, and are people wrong about that? Because I think Peterson's whole thing is he got this from I can't pronounce it well, Solzhenitsyn,
yes,
who made that argument. And how, two sides.
Yep.
How did the people advocating for socialism today, DSA or otherwise,
mm-hmm.
how do they deal with that argument?
Mm-hmm.
And do they have a point, more broadly, relating to, say, 1788 leading to the Reign of Terror? How is it possible that breaking down unjust structures doesn't lead to the creation of more unjust structures? Because looking empirically at history, the argument that breaking down structures leads to more unjust structures is reasonable.
Right. So I guess I'm most curious about. Okay. So let's work backwards. Let's start at the end of the question. It seems to me that there are actually quite a few examples historically of unjust structures that have been replaced, not necessarily with just structures, but at least ones that were less unjust than the ones they're replacing, right? I mean, just like off the top of my head, the abolition of slavery, which was we don't use the word to describe it, right? But like what in any other context you call a revolution, right? That there were armies that fought each other over what form of social organization to have. Tremendous amounts of blood were spilled, in the process, etc. And even though unfortunately it didn't like immediately lead to complete racial equality, to put it mildly, there's a lot of very ugly history. I'm in caps, telegraphing there, but I think that the replacement of slavery with even sharecropping and various other like things that were still very unjust, but it's still a big improvement, right? If you can't be bought and sold and legally beaten and things like that, that's a step up. So that's one example that certainly comes to mind. I think that the end of I think another example along the same lines would be the end of segregation. They have I think we can. All right, I'm not just going to sit here and list off all the things that I would count as instances of social progress, because I think the core of your question is probably about and even with you mentioned 1789, right, in France, and I think that I would actually say the end result of that process, right, like there's a lot of stuff, so I'm not miscommunicating here, right? Reign of Terror, bad. I'm against it, right? But I do think that the end result of that process was something that was much better than what came before it, right? That feudal rights and obligations, serfdom, et cetera, all ended. Legal equality, for all citizens under the law, et cetera. So. And I think that, in France that happened with a lot of horrible bloodshed, but there were even other places where it happened with a lot less bloodshed. But the core of your question, I take it, isn't really about the sort of more general claim, right? That about breaking down unjust structures. I think maybe the core of your claim is. Okay, maybe it is. All right.
So sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Actually, that'd be good to get clear on because I sort of took it that the sort of main examples you had in mind were like the communist revolutions of the 20th century,
and also the French Revolution, but mainly yes. But I would agree that using the communist revolutions from the Bolshevik Revolution. To, I guess, 1989, it is too patent. I think a more empiricist look at those events are very important. And I appreciate what a lot of people on the left do that call for that. I think that's a very good idea. So I guess what you want me to say, do you want to just get to does Marx lead to Lenin and Stalin? Yeah. So I guess we might as well get to that.
Sure, fair enough. And yes, and you're absolutely right. We do want to disentangle those things. That was a point I meant to make earlier. You were sort of listing off, some historical examples, and you did something that I've heard Jordan Peterson do too, which is that, when you're sort of mentioning some of the worst ones, right? You casually throw in Cambodia, and I think that's a really interesting case because. If you're just sort of trying to make this big lump case about the history of communism, like, the Black Book of Communism, here are all the bad things that happened. Cambodia is a really interesting case to throw in there because the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot was actually invaded by communist Vietnam, in an attempt to stop the killing fields, and the United States backed the Khmer Rouge against them for Cold War reasons. And this is not some leftist conspiracy theory. I'm talking about, like, UN votes, right? This is a matter of public record. So, yes, it is important to disentangle some of these things. But look, even the best of them, right, there's still some things that are very bad about them, right? Even in cases where I think you can make a case that these events were some sort of overall improvement, like, maybe before you had a dictatorship and horrible grinding poverty and racial segregation, like Cuba, before 1959, and afterwards you have a dictatorship, but, you at least alleviate some of those features. And there are some important improvements there, literacy, child mortality, et cetera, et cetera. But even the best cases of this system, they're still very bad in certain ways, right? They don't allow free press. You can't have multiple political parties or meaningful elections. And if any attempt to get beyond capitalism is going to lead to that, then that's a pretty good reason to not want that to happen, because we like free press and multi-party elections and all this stuff. So what I would say is I don't see a straight line there. I think that that certainly, you talked, you mentioned the DSA in your question, right? So if you look at the DSA's documents, online, where there's a sort of attempt, okay, what do we mean by socialism? What could that look like, right? And what I talk about is maybe some combination of what are sometimes called the commanding heights of the economy, being nationalized in some form, combined with workers' control, co-determination, right? Workers having certain seats on governing boards, with as much of the rest of the economy being organized as decentralized workers' cooperatives. Whatever you want to say about that, and whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, it's a very different idea, right, than the Soviet model of what was called socialism there. And if you want to tell a story about that line from Marx to Lenin to Stalin, then I think one thing you have to look at is, well, what does Marx say, right? Like if we're going to say that the fact that like Stalin is claiming the legacy of Marx, and that's kind of good enough to damn him, right? That I think that's a bad idea. I think that's going to lead you to lose a lot of interested insights. I think, like, if we applied the same principle to one of Jordan Peterson's favorite philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, right, we'd have to say, well, Hitler claimed Nietzsche's legacy, right? And therefore, Hitler was bad, so Nietzsche must have been bad, despite the fact that Nietzsche was actually a fierce critic of German nationalism, anti-Semitism, etc. And similarly, if we look at Marx, he was a consistent critic of censorship. He was opposed to the death penalty. The phrase from Marx that out of context sounds most Stalin-y, right, is dictatorship of the proletariat, that, he sometimes talks about the idea, on this sort of Roman analogy, right, the Roman Republic, right, you'd have a temporary dictatorship, but remember, it's of the proletariat, right, of the working class, right? So this idea that during the transition from capitalism to socialism, the working class would somehow be imposing its will, right, on the rest of society, that's the metaphor. And you say, okay, but what exactly does that mean, right? And actually, we have a pretty good idea, because Marx had a historical example, something that really happened, which was the Paris Commune in 1871, where workers and soldiers mutinied and took over the city of Paris. And whatever you want to say about it, whether you think the Paris Commune was a good thing or a bad thing, it was something that was very unlike Stalin's Russia, right? It was this radically democratic experiment where abandoned factories were taken over and run as workers' cooperatives, where every like the standing army was replaced by a popular militia. Every government official was paid no more than the average wage of a skilled worker. Every government official could be replaced, could be recalled by the electors at any time and for any reason. In fact, it was such a radically democratic experiment that not only the Marxist wing of the socialist movement at the time supported it, but so did the anarchist wing. So I think that if you're going to tell a story whereby the bad things about the Soviet Union, for example, are a result of something they got from Marx, at the very least, it's going to have to be a slightly more complicated story, because on the face of it, what Marx said he advocated and what happened in the Soviet Union do look pretty different.
Do you think that the contemporary group of public intellectuals relies too heavily on our sanitized, and historical view of these events and philosophies, and they don't devote enough time to create an original thought for contextual problems of today? Does that make sense?
Maybe. Let me see if I've got you right. Right. So So at first you were talking about like sanitized versions of past thinkers. So I thought maybe you were going somewhere maybe a little bit different.
No. So maybe I'll say it again.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Do you think these public intellectuals rely too heavily on old philosophies that are 200-300 years old, and a sanitized view of history filled with propaganda from one side or the other, and not enough time devoted to original thought dealing with contextual problems of today and those that we see coming towards us?
Okay. No, I think I got you now. Yeah. So I think some of this, of course, depends on which public intellectuals you have in mind. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but it's a big group, right?
Absolutely.
So I think certainly as far as like sanitized versions of history, there are at least some left-wing public intellectuals that I would like Noam Chomsky, who I think whatever you can say about him, he's certainly not talking about any sanitized version of any history. But I think the larger issue about doing sort of original thought versus relying on insights from philosophers from hundreds of years ago is a much bigger thing that maybe I'm a little bit more ambivalent about, right? Because my own academic background is in what's sometimes called analytic philosophy, so people will sort of make a distinction between the kind of philosophy where, I don't know, maybe put crudely, like what you're really interested in is like, you look at some 600-page book by Heidegger or somebody that's like really impenetrable, and the sort of pleasure of it is like trying to figure out what he's saying, and and then like maybe you and how it might hook up to what other people are saying, and so that's what's sometimes called continental philosophy, like the European continent, whereas analytic philosophy emphasizes a lot more kind of argumentative clarity and precision, which are good values. Those are things I like. But then analytic philosophers end up talking a lot amongst each other about like, okay, to what extent is sort of history relevant, right? Should we think of the history of philosophy maybe the way we think about the history of biology, right? That like, oh, it's sort of an interesting subfield that's like, yeah, it's kind of intellectually interesting to see what biologists, in the past thought, but it's not going to tell us very much about biology. Or is philosophy a fundamentally different kind of thing? And there I would say that I think philosophy is a fundamentally different kind of thing, that you have that people who lived hundreds of years ago, oftentimes the issues that they're talking about are still relevant, and in fact the arguments they're making about them are often still just as plausible as anything that people are saying now, not just because the issues are so intractable, right? That like, in other words, biology progresses in a way that's a little bit more obvious how it works than philosophy does, right? There's an unkind joke that gets the idea across about a budget-cutting dean who's talking to the chair of the chemistry department and saying, "Hey, why do you guys you keep racking up all these expenses, these test tubes, this lab equipment? Why can't you be like the math department? All they need are like papers and pencils and trash cans, or better yet, like the philosophy department. All they need are the papers and pencils." Right, and so I think that it's much harder to like empirically refute a philosophical claim just by the nature of the claims, all of which I guess is a long-winded way of saying that like that if you're interested in something that like David Hume or Friedrich Nietzsche or somebody who lived hundreds of years ago wrote about, well, given that we're not necessarily at some wonderful epistemic advantage now. It's not like, oh yeah, now that back then they didn't get it, but now we've figured this all out, right? Because the issues are innately tricky for doing that. Then, well, you might as well see what some of the smartest people who've ever lived thought about it. That might be helpful.
So, one quick follow up. Would you then, suppose that people in the past, thinkers and intellectuals in the past, were somehow more wise or inherently smarter than people today?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's just that. I think that maybe it's like a lot of things in the past that you don't have to think that you don't necessarily think that at any given point in the past there were more great novelists or more great painters than there are in 2019. It's not like there used to be more of them and now they thinned out. It's that once a bunch of time has passed, we can kind of tell who the best ones were, right? Who like had the most lasting impacts, right? And oftentimes that does create the impression that it was better, right? Like if you're as much of a classic rock nerd as I am, you can think, oh yeah, the 1970s, it's like music was just much better. But now that there's Sirius XM, has a channel of 70s stuff, it's like, oh no, most of this was crap, right? It's just that the stuff that you're most likely to have been exposed to is the stuff that was the best music from that decade, right? So I think similarly, it's not that there was anything special about the 1700s that you had that people were more likely to be Hume or Kant level brilliant than they are right now. It's just that it maybe kind of takes a while to see, oh yeah, who had the like really interesting things to say that people are still going to be talking about in 100 years.
Hey, I'm afraid I don't know that I know what cultural Marxism is either, but I've seen Jordan Peterson talk, on YouTube a lot, and he seems like where he ran into a problem was being told to use certain pronouns, right? And I've heard him refer to that as like Marxism, cultural Marxism, whatever. And I see a parallel between that and like our mayor, saying that, well, certain racial groups are disproportionately impacted by certain laws, so we're not going to enforce those. And I see Carranza, our education chancellor, who was replacing these qualified white female executives with less qualified, allegedly, people of color. And in California, the university system, many excesses, and talking about equality committees being sort of hired, and it just seems like faceless bureaucrats. And in everything that you're saying, there's a historical bent to it. You're referring to all the sort of different strains of communist thinking, I guess. But what I had hoped to hear is like justify for me why white people are apologizing for being white all the time, and explain to me why somebody should give up a job that they've earned for somebody who hasn't earned it. And why is it that we can't even decide what's true anymore?
All right, well, there's a lot going on there. I'm going to shock you and say I have a different perspective about some of that stuff. For example, as the majority of people I know are white, and I've never heard any of them apologize for it. And I think that what's sometimes described as apologizing for being white, is not necessarily most charitably described that way. I'd like to see. Again, I don't want to say nobody says X, because you can always find somebody, right? Say, oh no, somebody told me on Twitter just the other day, that they were sorry about that. But I think that given disparities given economic disparities, who's more likely to live in poverty, who is, for a variety of reasons, I'm not a fan of the mayor, but I don't think that he's wrong when he says that that certain policing practices do seem to unfairly, disproportionately target some people rather than others. I don't look out at that landscape. I see what the relative positions, what the relative economic positions of white people on average and black people on average in the United States are, what the realities are with regard to policing, prisons, et cetera, et cetera. I don't look at all that and say, well, the main problem here is that people are too apologetic about being white. Now, maybe, I'm sure you can come up with examples of people who've said silly things along those lines. We can disagree about how prevalent it is. In some ways, that's kind of the least interesting argument to have about it, right? About any of this stuff is how many people are saying X, how many people are saying Y, because, I can kind of give you my impression, you can give your impression, but really we're just kind of wasting our time if we don't do some sort of study, to have some real data about that. I perceive that as much less of a problem. But to go back to Jordan Peterson, because he's who you started your question with. Jordan Peterson originally became famous because he was objecting to something called C-16 in Canada, which all it did was add gender identity to Canada's pre-existing human rights law. Even though the word pronoun did not appear anywhere in this law, look it up, it's not there, right? He was convinced that the effect of this law would be what he calls forced speech, that it would force people to use trans pronouns, and that they would be penalized in some way if they didn't do so, and that he in particular would be penalized in some way if he didn't do so at university. And what I really have a hard time getting past about this is that he lost that fight, right? This is on the books. It's been on the books for a couple of years. And nobody has been arrested for misgendering somebody. Nobody has been even fined for misgendering anybody. So all of the hubbub about how this was such a grave threat to free speech, it looks to me like he misinterpreted the law. Now, is there a general critique? Okay. All right. If you can give me some examples of some Canadians who've been fined for pronoun misuse in the last couple of years, then I will have learned something interesting tonight. I certainly don't know of any. Right? Maybe they're telling me. Maybe they're lying to me. Right? Canadians I know tell me that they're none. But hey, if so, I'm against that. Right? I agree with Peterson about this. I think that a more constructive way of doing it might have been to advocate amending the law to clarify that you couldn't do that, but still extending these human rights protections to a group that is in fact often and horribly victimized and could really benefit from that. I also think there's a general civil libertarian critique that you could make of Canadian hate speech laws, which, I'm an ACLU guy. I think everybody should have a First Amendment, right? I'm against, penalizing speech of any kind. I did find it really interesting, though, that Peterson never seemed to take it there, right? He never seemed to say, hey, we shouldn't have hate speech laws in general, right? We should just have this sort of general, we should have this sort of hardcore ACLU interpretation of the First Amendment. We should have that in Canadian law. He said we shouldn't extend the human rights law to include gender identity because this could lead to that. And if he'd said the first thing rather than the second thing, then I think a lot of Peterson's critics on the left would have probably been a lot more sympathetic.
Well, so let's remind you again, let's keep it so away from the microphone. Lucas.
Yeah. I wanted to ask a question about, you sort of talked about, he talked about, is there a through line from Marx to Lenin and Stalin? And Solzhenitsyn says there is, and a lot of people say that there isn't.
Sure.
You bring up the example of the Paris Commune as an example of what he really meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Well, it's the example he pointed to, but yeah, go on.
Right. So I guess the question I'm asking is, if we know that historically, whether misinterpreted or not, certain things led to certain real world events. The other example I'm thinking of when you brought up slavery earlier is these sort of defenses of slavery in the Bible, which, you talk to any number of Christians, and of course they will tell you that to say that this meant any defense of slavery in a modern context was a gross misinterpretation. And maybe it is, but the question is, since we know that Southern slave owners actively pointed to the Bible as a robust defense of the institution, should we start to maybe think twice about using this as a supreme source of authority? And so when we're thinking of Marxist texts and what they led to in history, rightly or wrongly, in either case, should we still think twice about how these ideas played out in the real world, regardless of the intent of the writer? And is it the sort of thing where we have to be at least willing to use a scalpel and say, well, this isn't what he really meant, but it has, whether rightly or wrongly interpreted, led to many, many problems, and we need to be very careful about bandying it about as something that is still wonderful and we don't have to worry about.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting analogy, and it's particularly interesting because, of course, in the slavery case, the Bible was used by the Southern slaveholders to defend slavery, but then again, the abolitionist movement was also Christian through and through, and like thoroughly inspired by that also. And so even though I'm an atheist, right, I have no particular brief, for the Bible. I think that even if what they were saying about slavery wasn't an endorsement of what it meant in the contemporary American context, I tend to think that what it meant in its original context is bad enough, right? But I'm a little leery to criticize Christianity on the grounds that the people who were on the wrong side of this used it, because I think that in that particular case, I'd say, well, the whole cultural context was just so suffused with Christianity that I don't know that I'd really fault Christianity for people drawing bad conclusions from it any more than I'd necessarily give Christianity credit for people drawing good conclusions for it. I'd just say that, like, that was just kind of the air people were breathing, and whatever arguments they were making about anything were going to be framed as Christian arguments, which now you might say, well, okay, so maybe that's Christianity off the hook, but but Marxism, if anything, looks worse in that analogy, right? Because it's not like both sides of the Russian Revolution, saw themselves as Marxists, and the Tsar had like his favorite passages of Marx, and Lenin had his favorite passages. It's the only people in that situation who are calling themselves Marxists, more or less, right? Are the people who are doing those things. But I guess the crucial question there is it true that that's what led to that, right? In other words, we certainly have a correlation there, right? That there are people who are calling themselves Marxists who are doing bad things. Now, I would also point out that even though there were fewer of them, right, there were always people who were called themselves Marxists who were against those things, right? That is as early as the Russian Revolution happens in 1917. as early as 1918, Rosa Luxemburg has a pamphlet that she's written, critique of the Russian Revolution, and there's a pretty continuous tradition since then of democratic socialist dissent from that. But I think that I think that the crucial question is, okay, is the source of the authoritarian aspects of what the Bolsheviks, for example, might be doing, is the source of this something that they're getting from Marx? And what I'd say is, well, to try to figure that out, we'd kind of have to compare them to other authoritarian dictatorships that weren't influenced by Marx. Is there something about Marx, about what they were getting from Marx that influenced them in particular? Is there something that made those worse than other ones? Were they worse than other ones that were authoritarian dictatorships that didn't call themselves Marxists? And I would just say, maybe there's a case to be made that Marx is, as Peterson says, the source of all the trouble there. But I think that case, I think that you need to work harder to make that case than to just kind of point out, hey, Lenin called himself a Marxist, Stalin called himself a Marxist, case closed.
This will be a really quick question. I think on a practical level, what we're doing now is, I think it's really awesome. First of all, I use the analogy of a noise filter, where people tend to hear the most extreme examples and the most fringe noise coming from the other side, and that caricatures what they see is what the other side's saying. So just an example with a Gillette commercial and the talk about toxic masculinity is a classic example of just piss poor translation of what ideas mean. So you have like what most people I think are saying when they're talking about men improving certain, or at least trying to help other men be better men. Like we all agree with that. There is a fringe that belongs in a South Park episode that really are batshit crazy and that really do tell men that you are inherently toxic, you're inherently bad. It really is. There really is that out there. It's not what most people are saying, but that's what a lot of people hear. And we've been balkanized in these tribes, so we think that's what this tribe means. I wonder if we could use this model of almost having a workshop where one side will say, "What do you think we're saying?" And then they say, "Actually, here's what we're really trying to say." And then the other side can actually unpack their criticisms and say, here's what we're concerned about. And even 30 minutes of doing that, people can walk out of the room and be like, wow, I actually didn't realize that's what you were really saying, or I didn't realize that's what you were concerned about. So it'd be like an incubator for marriage counseling between not even just left and right, but it's just centrist and liberals. I mean, you just look at this dumpster fire model on YouTube where people talk trash back and forth. They're only trying to be right. They're not trying to understand each other. So I wonder if this could be a model we could scale up across campuses where these 20-year-old, I'm trying to hold my language here, but a lot of these gifted new millennials, just to be polite, could learn a little bit of humility and the willingness to be wrong, and also learn how to communicate and get off their spaceship and talk to people, because I think there's a lot people can learn from, and I consider myself a new centrist, but a lot of my leftist friends are really smart. There's a lot you can learn by listening to each other. So, I think this could be, what are your thoughts on scaling up this model of just political marriage counseling, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, I mean, you contrasted it to YouTube comments, and then I realized that I said something very indefensible earlier, which is I said that Twitter is the devil, because how could Twitter possibly be the devil when YouTube comments are so much worse? Twitter is like a minor demon. That's the devil. Yeah, I mean, I'm in. Look, I mean, I don't want to be too kumbaya about this, I think there are intractable political disagreements. I think sometimes people have different values. Oftentimes people have different interests, and that relies on this. But it is also true that we do live in a very, very segmented media bubbles, and that oftentimes what we get in those bubbles, is very tribally affirming to us, but and it's entertaining, and it keeps eyeballs on programming, but it doesn't necessarily help you think harder about it, and this is one of the I mean, look, there's a reason, I think that if the one thing I think the Q&A has established is that people, this audience, have very different perspectives on a lot of things than I do, which was not something that was surprising, right? But, you know, when I always tell people, you know, because I've not too much, I don't want to exaggerate, right? You know, but I've gotten like a little bit of a shit, you know, from some people, but oh my God, why would you write for Quillette, right? And, you know, it's like, oh, but, you know, and they'll sort of bring up ideological criticisms that I don't necessarily disagree with, but I think that that kind of misses the point that, you know, if, that, yeah, I expect most people who read Quillette and most people who write for Quillette disagree with me about a lot of things, but if you're only talking to people you agree with, what's the point, right? You know, it's like when, you know, there were people who, you know, a month ago, whenever this was, there were people who were just about ready to burn Bernie Sanders in effigy for doing a Fox News town hall. Right. Said, you know, oh my God, I can't believe that he'd do that. He'd legitimize this horrible, evil, you know, news network. And, you know, I have lots and lots of criticisms of Fox News. I don't think anybody's gonna be shocked to hear that, right? But dude's running for president. It's the most popular cable news network in the country of which he was running for president. It would be objectively insane not to do that, right? You know, if you're, you know, if you're not making your arguments to persuade to people who don't start out agreeing with you, then what you're doing is maybe providing entertainment or affirmation for people who do, but you're certainly not going to move the needle, and I certainly don't see much point.
Well, it might make you happy to know that I think most people in here disagree about everything. So just because they read Quillette doesn't really mean anything. You'll see us at the bar afterwards if you want to come, and it'll get quite nasty. Thank you, Ben. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Well,
any final thoughts?
With an invitation like that, I don't know how I can say no.
All right. Thank you, guys.